Bertie AHERN says he will only meet them to discuss an unequivocal IRA ceasefire. Monetary union row resolved after France lifts its veto on completing the Amsterdam Treaty. And a windfall for 150,000 Irish investors with the Norwich Union flotation. Good evening. We'll have reaction to today's shootings from Dublin, Belfast and Washington.
And we'll be reporting from Amsterdam on the opening day of the European Summit here, which for the Taoiseach and the British Prime Minister has been very much overshadowed by today's double murder in Lurgan.
But first tonight, our main story, 2 IUC officers have been shot dead by the IRA in Lurgan Town Centre in County Armagh. The 2 victims have been named as 34-year-old John Graham and 30-year-old David Johnston. Both were from Lisburn. The killings have been widely condemned and fears are now growing for the future of the Loyalist ceasefire.
The attack happened just before midday. The 2 community police officers were ambushed while on a routine foot patrol on Church Lane, just yards from Lurgan RUC station. Both officers were hit in the head at close range by at least 2 attackers, and the 2 men died at the scene. Locals said they heard at least 5 shots.
Just down at the back, hanging out my wife on the lane, we heard the shots. The girl on the next house to us, she said that sounds awful like shots, and she heard the siren going then and turned out and said that there was 2 policemen laying dead up the street.
The car used in the attack was later found burned out in the Republican Kilwilkie estate, about 1.5 miles from the scene. Confirmation of Republican involvement was made when a caller, using a recognised code word, said the IRA's North Armagh Brigade had killed the 2 police officers.
This type of murder can never be justified, and that includes police officers carrying out their public duty. These were 2 officers on beat patrol, carrying out a service to the whole of this community, and this type of slaying, as I said, just numbs all of us.
The 2 police officers were in their 30s. Both were married with children.
How would you describe these people that carried out the attack?
I would have some difficulty in describing them. They're heartless, inhumane murderers. They have no thought for people or for this community.
As if tensions weren't already high enough, these 2 cold-blooded killings have raised fears amongst the nationalist community of a loyalist backlash. The attack happened not far from the stronghold of the renegade Loyalist Volunteer Force. The implications of that are all too obvious.
The killings have been widely condemned and there have been calls for no retaliatory action from Loyalist paramilitaries. The British government has cancelled a planned meeting with Sinn Féin, and the Northern Secretary MOWLAM has spoken of the hypocrisy and cynicism of those who carried out the murders. Sinn Féin's Gerry Adams said he was personally shocked.
9 weeks ago, the IRA tried to kill policewoman Alice Collins in Derry. Since then, their campaign has been a low-key one, but today's attack seems to dash any hope that that might continue in the wake of Sinn Féin's electoral successes. Indeed, David Trimble spoke for many in Northern Ireland when he said the Lurgan killings were intended to provoke.
I'm quite sure that the time and the location of these murders were no accident, that they're deliberately designed by the Republican movement to exacerbate feeling in the community, to provoke a reaction from Loyalist paramilitaries and to destabilise society. And I would add my appeal to anyone involved or connected with Loyalist paramilitarism: don't play the IRA's game.
A call echoed by those politicians who speak for Loyalist paramilitaries, who nonetheless warned that the situation was bleak.
And I have to point out that there is a very, very dark and foreboding situation facing us all. But we as a party will continue to do all that we can to try and ensure that loyalism does not return to violence. What I would ask is that all other political leaders and representatives do what they can to try and dampen the situation at the present time.
In the face of all this, Gerry Adams said that while he was shocked, the killings should be a spur to those involved in the peace process.
And that has to be a huge incentive upon those of us in political leadership to redouble our efforts to get the peace process restored.
But Mr. Adams must have known that the political reality of today's killings was inescapable, and that his party's remaining meeting with MOWLAM's officials would not now be going ahead.
We made an effort with Sinn Féin. Both governments talked to officials on both sides, and we've been faced now tonight with this act of what I think is just plain hypocrisy and cynicism. And so there is no doubt that no one will be talking to Sinn Féin in the present circumstances.
Dr. MOWLAM spent much of the afternoon in meetings with security chiefs. It's clear that maintaining what's left of a fragile peace has now moved to the top of her agenda.
Here in Amsterdam, the Taoiseach, Mr. Bruton, and the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, came together after their summit meeting to condemn the killings in the strongest possible terms. They met for 15 minutes here at the Summit Centre and afterwards challenged Gerry Adams to distance Sinn Féin from the murders by condemning them. Mr. Bruton said the killings were aimed at maximising sectarian strife. Mr. Blair said that in the new circumstances there could be no question of contacts between Sinn Féin and his government. Here's our political editor, Donal Kelly.
The news of the Lurgan murders appalled Europe's political leaders. The inherent contradiction between their attempts to forge closer ties between their countries and the latest evidence of violent division in Northern Ireland wasn't lost on any of them. The Taoiseach, in a statement, described the killings as cowardly and deliberately provocative. Later, Mr. Bruton had a 15-minute meeting with British Prime Minister Tony Blair to discuss the implications of the killings for the efforts to renew the peace process. Both were strong in their condemnation.
This was an absolutely appalling act of brutality, a totally callous murder. And it is all the more appalling because we were working hard to build momentum back into the process to find a lasting settlement for people in Northern Ireland. And it's difficult to see this as anything other than a deliberate attempt to frustrate that process working.
I think that this is deliberately provocative, as the Prime Minister has said. They're seeking to evoke a reaction. The location of this double murder was chosen in order to have the maximum sectarian strife caused because it is close to the site of contentious parades. And the attempt is clearly being made by the Republican movement to generate sectarian passion in Northern Ireland.
Mr. Bruton then attacked Gerry Adams' statement that at a human level the killings diminished everyone.
For him to say that this diminishes us all is the height of hypocrisy. This is a murder committed by an organisation with which his political party is indistinguishably allied. And I reject his use of these weasel words. And that's all they are, weasel words, to evade his responsibility.
I would like to see Mr. Adams face up to the responsibility of condemning it outright, no hesitation, no weasel words, but condemning it as any decent human being should do.
Will you end contact then, Prime Minister, between the British government and Sinn Féin?
There can be no question of talking in these circumstances.
Should BERTIE AHERN go ahead with its plans then to meet Mr. Adams before the Dáil resumes on June the 26th?
Of course not.
That would be your advice to him?
I would be appalled if he went ahead with a meeting in these circumstances.
The anger of the two men was palpable, both clearly concerned that peace in the north was in the balance.
The Fianna Fáil leader, Mr. AHERN, has described the IRA gun attack as an evil, irresponsible and provocative action. Mr. AHERN also said any meeting with Sinn Féin would be meaningless unless it was about an unequivocal restoration of the ceasefire.
As far as I'm concerned, there's a fundamental issue of trust, and that trust must be resolved by the Republican movement. They cannot give conflicting signals. If the signal is that they want to move forward on the peace process, then they must give that, which we're talking about a restoration of the ceasefire. Otherwise, we're talking about killing people. I can only be left today, and my feeling today, all day, is that people, for one reason or another, have decided that they're going to continue killing people. If that is the feeling of people, then there's no point in talking to me.
But then the question to you is then, how will you know whether Gerry Adams is serious enough? Because in the next couple of days, the people who may be going to arrange that meeting may be coming to you or somebody in Fianna Fáil saying, Mr. AHERN, is the meeting on or is it not?
There is no meeting at this stage arranged.
And has it made it even more difficult now that given what's happened today?
Of course it has.
Has it slammed the door on it?
No, it's made it more difficult. If people want to talk about the restoration of the ceasefire, of course we have to continue to try to move that forward. but that does not seem to be the signal.
So what you're saying, if there is to be any meeting, it must be simply the restoration of the ceasefire and nothing else?
Several times I've stated that.
Mr. Ahern, can I ask you one other question? What about, even though you weren't looking for Caoimhín O'Crélón's support in the Dáil when you want to be elected Taoiseach next week, clearly it would appear he was going to vote for you anyway. I mean, is this not an embarrassment?
I don't know if he was or not. I've stated my position on that and consistently stuck to it. I've had no discussions whatsoever with him about his vote next week.
And you wouldn't?
No, I've made that clear. I have no intention of it.
The White House has described the Lurgan shootings as an outrageous act of cowardice. President Clinton's press secretary, Mike McCurry, said the US government understood the reasons why the British had decided to break contact with Sinn Féin. He commended the loyalist paramilitaries for their restraint and called on them to continue to honour their ceasefire.
The White House has never been ambivalent about its opposition to violence in Northern Ireland. And in response to today's killings in Lurgan, it stepped up its rhetoric.
The IRA has claimed responsibility for what is ultimately an outrageous act of cowardice, an outrageous act of terrorism, and no one should ever make the mistake of thinking that actions of this kind represent anything equating to patriotism.
The White House has continued its private contacts with all parties to the peace process, including Sinn Féin. Today, Mike McCurry said contacts would continue, but he seemed to give a veiled warning to the Republican movement.
The United States government has had contact with parties that we have always believed have been helpful to the peace process. And I would say we would continue contacts that we believe are helpful to the process. But sooner or later it becomes clear who's willing to help the process and who's not.
On Capitol Hill, Senator Edward Kennedy was more direct, saying this was the moment of truth for Sinn Féin. He said they must produce a ceasefire, or else completely disassociate themselves from those who commit or condone acts of terrorism. There had been cautious optimism here in Washington, following the election of Tony Blair as British Prime Minister. People here were impressed by his handling of the peace process, and hoped the IRA would respond with a ceasefire. Now, instead of optimism, there is anger, and a deep sense of frustration.
Other news now, and more than 150